Hey everybody, welcome to the Pretendo podcast. It's me, Jason,
Me, McKinley.
and today we're going to talk about a few different things. One of them is going to be retro gaming 101. There's a lot of people that want to get into retro gaming, and there's different reasons why you do, and I think today I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can get into it, what to look for, and like to do it the right way.
So he's basically going to be the Yoda to my Luke.
Um, First, I want to talk about the reasons why you would get into retro gaming. Aside from there being a plethora of wonderful games to play and get into, we have different aspects. If you're in it and you want to collect, it's a lot different if you're in it and you just want to play games. If you're just looking to play games, you don't really want to collect consoles and systems. There's a few different ways you can go. There's a lot of like retro consoles out there that are made just to play retro games, like the Retron consoles and the AVS console for the NES games. If you don't want to play like on an old console and you want to play something a little different, some of them like the AVS system does have HDMI outs and everything, and it upscales everything, and your frame rates are quite better because newer TVs, you know, they're quite different than the old CRT things. So if you got something like that, you would still have to buy the cartridges and all that. If you didn't want to do that, I don't support emulating things unless you own them, like I do. When I play games, I will emulate instead of putting the wear and tear on my cartridges or my CDs or whatever I'm using. Right. I'll just emulate the games like that. If you do want to go like an electronic route, I would go with things like the Atari Flashbacks and the NES Classics and the SNES Classic that's coming out. That's a great way to play some of the best games for the systems without actually having to take up space, putting up cartridges and things up on shelves.
So if you get one of these old systems and you have one of these new TVs, like where do you go to get maybe like an adapter or something like that so you can actually play what you bought?
Well, I know for Nintendo and the N64 as well, sometimes there's a lot of TVs still have the old RCA inputs,
right.
But when it comes to the frame rate, it can kind of get a little weird, and there can be a delay, so you press like the button and nothing's happening on the screen, so it makes a very fast game, more noticeable with the slowdown. There are items like the Frame Meister that kind of keeps everything going at the correct rate. It has everything moving a little bit. That is one device that you could buy and hook up. There are some retro clone like consoles, like I was saying, like the AVS for the an NES system that turns it into an HDMI, and you don't really get that loss of frame rate. So there's ways to get around it. Aside from that, you could always just get like an old TV and play the games on it.
And those devices you were talking about, like, can you get them on eBay?
Oh yeah, you can get them online. You just look for them pretty much anywhere. There are companies who sell them. Like obviously the AVS is sold by a specific company. I can't think of who it is right now. I'm sure I'll figure it out.
Not super expensive.
No, Hyperkin makes the Retron series of consoles.
Right.
I have the Retron 3, which plays Nintendo, Super Nintendo, and Sega Genesis games.
Sweet. But
they're up to I think 5 right now, which plays a whole bunch of them. I think there's Game Boy Advance, and stuff as well in there. So, and there are people who make sort of these hybrid systems all around.
Okay.
And there's some people who, they can play Atari games, they can play anything you could almost think of on these systems. I think for later generation consoles like the N64,
right,
and the PlayStation, the first PlayStation,
right,
you're probably better off getting those consoles, buying the consoles and then playing the games on those consoles,
right,
because that's really the best way that they play. Okay. And there's, like the PlayStation's a CD-based game. It's harder I don't really know of very many like retro emulation consoles out there for
Right.
CD based games. I'm sure there's some. I just don't know anything about it.
Right. Right.
So if you're interested in playing a Dreamcast, then get a Dreamcast and buy the games for Dreamcast.
Right.
GameCube's the same thing. If you're gonna play GameCube games, um, honestly, GameCubes aren't that expensive. I find them in thrift stores all the time for like $15. But if you're really in a pinch, you can play them on the Wii.
Right.
So the original Wii plays GameCube games, so you can just play them right off of Wii if you want to play them.
Dope.
Yeah.
So now let me ask you about collecting. So like guys like me who missed the boat and wasn't really paying attention to like the earlier models when they came out, how can we tell an authentic console, older console, from something, I don't know, some guy threw together in his garage?
Well, I don't think consoles are really being chopped up, and because there's no real money in it. If you want a NES console,
Right.
um, you can pretty much find one for like $50 or so. They're not that difficult to find. Same thing with a Super Nintendo. If you really want it, you can go on eBay. People are always selling them for like 75 to $100. They come with a game. I wouldn't pay that much. I know I can get them cheaper than that. And it's more the games, I think, that are more difficult to come by, because there's a lot of, like, if they're a good game,
Right.
they're usually more expensive. Rarity has a lot to do with it. Like Super Mario Brothers 3, for example, is a great game. It's a classic game on the NES.
Right.
But it's not an expensive game. You can get it for like $20, even on eBay. So it's not an expensive game. Something like, let me think. I don't want to go like too expensive, because there's games like
Right.
there's games like Action 52,
Okay.
which is an unlicensed game for the Nintendo. But it's like really bad. They're all crappy games on there. There's like 52 games or whatever, and they're really, really shitty.
Okay.
But it's a rare game because it was like unlicensed or whatever. So like to buy one, is like $500, maybe $350 if you're lucky. So they're an expensive game to find.
Yeah.
Which is really weird.
So what's like what's another really expensive game that's I guess collectible?
Well, Little Samson is...
Little Samson?
Yeah, Little Samson is maybe, at least in my mind that I can think of, is maybe the most expensive game as just a cartridge. I know stadium events can go for like, one went just recently for like $30,000, but that was like boxed and I think sealed and everything. I don't know what the cartridge itself goes for.
Right.
But they're pretty rare games.
30,000.
Yeah. Little Samson goes for like $4,000 to $6,000 on any given day. Maybe if somebody really wants to get rid of it, they can, they'll go lower than that. But a trend I have been noticing, and this is important for people just getting into the hobby, is start out, buy games that you like. So maybe test them out first, play them, maybe emulate them if you have to.
Right.
But like games that you really like first, and that are within a price range that you can afford. Don't go spending $200 on a game, because those games are very faked, a lot of them. So it's tough when you're first getting into the hobby to know what to look for.
Right.
Like, there's a reason, like a game like Little Samson, if it's, this is a $3,000 game, you really want to take the time to make sure it's the real deal, it's the real thing. And with technology being what it is today, it's very easy for people to fake these games, and they do all the time. There's reproductions all over eBay. And I would say to steer clear from reproductions, even if it's clearly a reproduction, they say it's a reproduction. I would steer very clear of those because a lot of those have problems.
Okay.
A lot of people get them and they expect to play them and then
Right.
realize like they break halfway through or like the chip melts or something because they're cheaply made. They're coming out of like places like Thailand and India and China and stuff,
Right.
and they're just mass produced reproductions. And reproductions are always easy once you open them up to know that they're a reproduction. A lot of times you can even tell just by looking at the label or something, or
Okay.
feeling the game cartridge. Like I have a cartridge here. This is an original cartridge, and it's got a pretty heavy like case. You can feel how thick the plastic is or whatever. The cases that you can get now, like reproduction cases and stuff, they're pretty cheap. They're pretty thin, and you
Okay.
can pick it up and know that it's not real. It's not a real cartridge.
Got you.
Not like an original one. But there is a huge market on eBay for some reason for reproductions.
Right.
And I'm seeing like some things. Okay, you can't. Let's say you can't get this game like a little Samson game, but you won't really want something in your collection.
Right.
You call it a placeholder even until you can actually afford a real one. Well, that's I guess fine, but they usually want like $30 or $25 for these reproduction games.
Right.
I feel like you could just buy another game at that price that's going to be a good game to play. But what I've been seeing are reproductions of games that don't cost that much anyway. Like people are trying to sell Super Metroid reproductions,
Okay.
and I'm not talking about homebrews or anything like that. Those are always fun to sort of buy,
Right.
especially on a cartridge. You can always go online, and a lot of these homebrews, that's where they come from, are online, and then somebody figures out a way to put them onto a cartridge, and it's kind of cool to play them on your system or whatever. But I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about actual reproductions of the actual game. And Super Metroid is a game that I've found myself very recently for like $40, which is a good price on it. I think like the average is 60 or so for a good copy.
Okay.
But they're selling reproductions of this game for $30 or $35. I'm just thinking to myself, why would I buy a reproduction of a game that I can buy for maybe like $5 or $10 more? That doesn't make any sense.
Right.
That's really stupid. And there's a lot of these that show up. There's almost reproductions of almost any game you can think of. Somebody's out there trying to make a reproduction of it and get money off it. It doesn't make sense. So I would say steer clear of them because a lot of times they don't work. If you go and you check the reviews on some of these things, they're like, people are writing back like it doesn't work. It showed up and it just doesn't play, or it melted after a week or something. And it's, what was the point of buying it? I don't know. Like, if you really want something that badly, wait until you can afford it.
Right. Okay. So out of curiosity, I mean, there's no way to really tell, but seeing how we're going more CD-based games and stuff like that, do you think their PS4 or whatever Xbox CD games would ever be collectible items, or no, that's not even really going to be a thing in 30, 40 years from now?
I don't know. I don't think Xbox is going to get there because a lot of games that were good on like original Xbox kind of got ported already and remakes on Xbox 360.
Okay.
And already games that were on Xbox 360 are being ported and re-released on Xbox One or in some digital form.
Right.
I don't really know that there's going to be a huge demand for those games in the future because I think they're just going to be always available.
Right.
So, and that's true with a lot of the retro games as well, like games on the Nintendo, Super Nintendo. A lot of these games you can just buy off like Virtual Console or whatever. Nintendo eShop, or a lot of arcade games are available off Xbox Live. So I mean, even a lot of the games that like I collect, you can buy. Like the Mega Man games, for example, very collectible
Right.
games, and you can go buy the Legacy Edition, CDs, and you can actually play them. So if you're a player, if you're looking to just play retro games, those are a good way. That is a good way to do it.
Right.
Is to buy these anthologies and stuff like that. PS3, I know, had like a Sega Genesis anthology game and stuff, so you could just play the games if that's what you're really interested in. So I think people who are buying the cartridges are separate from people who just want to play the retro games.
Right.
But is Xbox One gonna someday be collectible? No, because I think most of their games are barely on a DVD or Blu-ray or whatever anyway.
Right.
So they're already just a digital game. So I don't think there's no original copy to have or whatever.
Okay. So with digital gaming becoming more and more of a thing in the next 20 years, do you think the niche market of like collecting games will eventually like be near extinction, or do you think there'll always be a collect like things will always be worth collecting as far as gaming?
I think it's like any other thing that has become like in the 20th and the 21st century, collecting kind of became a thing, like a huge thing.
Right.
And just like everything before it, it's gonna eventually die down because the people who grew up with it and who loved it, the reason why it's booming now is because the 20 somethings and the 30 somethings all grew up with these games,
Right.
and that's what they remember from their childhood, and that's what they're playing now. They want to go back to it. They have jobs or whatever, and they have a little bit of money they want to spend,
Right.
and they're going to spend it on that. I remember when I was a kid, those people were all people who grew up in like the 60s and the 70s, and everybody wanted toys, and that market was huge, in the 90s for those old toys and things like that. Nobody's out there collecting. I'm sure there are some people, but I mean, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Right. But there's no big cry for like, little Orphan Annie trinkets and things,
Right.
Or little Abner, or any of that stuff that's like really old anymore. And at some point that was huge, everybody remembered
Right.
that, everybody wanted that. I remember like erector sets, like original erector sets and stuff like that. People are like, oh yeah, I want that. That's because I had that when I was a kid, and everybody's toy when they were a kid is always better than whatever's out now.
Right.
So, and it's probably the same thing with me and all the stuff that I collect and I have, I'm all like, oh yeah, what I had was better than what's out now. But that's not true. I collect Pops and Amiibos and stuff like that, and they're kind of neat. But I think those are still sort of catered to, our age group. And eventually it's going to change like it does every generation, I guess.
Right.
With everything moving digital, I do think that there's going to be a time when nostalgia is still going to exist because there's going to be something that came out when those people were young, but everything's going to be digital and still digital anyway, so it's not going to be difficult for them to just go and find it, you know. Oh, I saw this cartoon or whatever, and they'll be able to just find that stuff. There's a lot less physical stuff to have.
Right.
We don't have cartridges anymore, and you don't even really need to buy a game on a CD. You have the option with literally every console that's there now to buy almost any game, either physically or just digitally.
Right, true.
So even that's just going to be obsolete pretty soon, yeah. I think the retro gaming boom has maybe 5 or 6 years left before we start seeing like a big downturn in it, because we're just going to get older, and people who are really serious and are collecting, they're going to get everything they want.
Right.
So that's just going to be the end of, like, they'll move on to something else probably. I find that happening to myself, in fact, with comic books.
Right.
I go to conventions and stuff, and I'm always looking at things. And I have there are people who have tons and tons of comic books. I have a decent size of comic books, but what I have of comic books are books that issues and things that I really, have collected and sort of over the years systematically picked up more and more of what I wanted.
Right.
And you eventually get to a point where you have everything you want except for the things that are very expensive, tens of thousands of dollars or whatever, and you just can't buy that. You know what I mean? So those are the only things left out of your collection that you don't have. So you slow down in collecting. I don't really buy comic books that often because the only things I don't have are expensive things that I can't afford. So
let me ask you, what's your current prize position as far as comic book collection?
I don't know. I'd have to think because there's a lot of things that I've picked up. I have a few things that have been signed by Stan Lee that I like. One of the first comic books I ever had was X-Men 35, which is the first time that Spider-Man and the X-Men cross paths.
Oh, sweet.
And that got destroyed when I was a kid. And then I found one later on when I was in college, and that was one of the first ones I had signed by Stan Lee. So that one has a little bit of sentimental value to me as well. But I have a lot of comic books in here that are pretty hard to find. I had two New Mutants 98 because when it came out, it's the first time Deadpool showed up.
Okay, cool.
So when it first came out, it was no big deal because there was no Deadpool. Nobody knew who he was.
Right.
And I don't think he really got that popular until like 2000-ish. He didn't really come to, and he wasn't nearly as popular until probably mid 2000s somewhere as he is now.
Right.
So it wasn't a big deal. It was just some new character that came out and was like, oh, whatever. And I just happened to have a couple issues of it, and then years later, comes up, here's something that's worth a lot of money for different reasons.
Right.
Like a lot of the really old comic books, like X-Men 1 and the old like Amazing Fantasy 15, these are books that there weren't like a large run of to begin with.
Right.
So they were already kind of rare because comic books weren't really a thing. But now comic books from like the 90s that are worth a lot of money, there are millions of them made. But they're worth a lot of money because it's the first time like a character like Deadpool or something showed up. So that's what makes them worth a lot of money, not their rarity, because they're all over the place. There are millions of them made.
Right.
But yeah, I have a lot of stuff, and I couldn't pinpoint one thing in the comic collection that stands out over everything else. I have a lot of key issues and stuff, and it would take a while.
Do you know exactly how many comics you have right now?
No, I don't. I've actually made it a project to catalog everything. There's a lot of reasons. You get older and different things come to mind, and you think about, like, I want to catalog everything that I have, not just the comic books, but all the games and the systems and everything that I've collected. Not just to know what I have, but so that I know how much it is, and you insure it, because now, these things are worth a lot of money. There's thousands and thousands of dollars sitting in this room. If the house burned down or something like that, you're not going to be able to replace it so easily, and you want to insure it. So that's one of the reasons I want to catalog everything so that I can get an insurance quote on it, and then I can go from there and insure everything, which is a point, just as collecting in general, that you get to where that's something you have to do. Once your collection gets big enough, where you have something that's worth enough money to kind of think about, what if something happens to it, how am I going to replace it?
Right.
So, like with renter's insurance, for example, if you rent your house, or even homeowner's insurance, there are like divisions, and like renter's insurance, you get like, maybe you get like 20,000 or something for collectibles or something like that. And it's just like a general blanket thing. But if I go through and I figure out, okay, this is what I have, and this is what everything is worth, then you know how much coverage to get, and then It's not terribly expensive, but if you already have insurance, like car insurance, a lot of these insurance companies, they have different things, like they'll insure your home and your car and your collectibles, and
like subgenres
yeah,
of
exactly.
coverage.
And if you're in with one place, then it usually is cheaper anyway, just to kind of tack on something.
Cool. Okay, so next time I need a loan, I need to borrow $1,000. I could just be like, hey, let me hold that issue real quick. I got you.
Yeah. There are people, like, I don't have any games that are irreplaceable. I don't have a gold NWC cart sitting in the back. Even Pat the NES Punk, Pat Contry over there, he has his in a safe deposit box, so it's not even in his collection, you know, because it's a $25,000 game.